Could everyone please turn to chapter 18 of Job? So we've been spending the last few weeks in Job chapters 16 and 17, which were Job's response to the second speech of his friend Eliphaz, which is really the gentlest of his friends. In those responses, he began them in a very similar way to all those before, proclaiming the foolishness and the betrayal of his friends for attacking him in the way that they were, before moving on to complaining about his suffering, the pain he's in, the anguish that he suffers, before concluding with saying that God wanted to harm him and begging once again for someone to intercede and defend him both towards God and towards man. He continued by asserting that his death would come very soon, he'd be welcoming it, but then his tone shifted quite a bit near the end. In verses 8 and 9 of chapter 17, there was a lot of hope that he'd be remembered by and then inspire more righteous men in the future, that they'd look on what happened to him and know that when bad things happened to them, it didn't mean it was their fault, and even when everyone told them that it was their fault, they'd know better. This is a definite tonal shift from what he said before, where he was mostly saying he'd die and be forgotten and his life would have no meaning. He suddenly shifted it into having lots of meaning after he died. The people would remember him for many generations to come. And he then affirmed to the entire crowd that he had hope in paradise after death and in God delivering him to it. He stated that he would die, but he would still survive, and that when they died, they'd see why he had that hope. This is quite a difference from most of his speeches before. Most of them have been completely full of despair with no ounce of hope in them at all. And that changed near the end of chapter 17. But that small underpinning of hope near the end does not overtake his blasphemies against the Lord or his deep, deep pain and anguish that he still suffers. It's just a reason that he hasn't completely given up. It's because he knows that even though this life will end and it'll end in misery, there is something better ahead, and he does genuinely believe that. So Bildad, which is his second friend and one of the much angrier ones, responds in chapter 18. Then answered Bildad the Shuhite and said, "How long will it be ere ye make an end of words? Mark, and afterwards we will speak. Wherefore we counted as beasts and reputed vile in your sight." So, as we've come to expect, he starts off by saying that Job is speaking foolishness, empty words, and he needs to be quiet. This is how pretty much all of them start their speeches. Job accuses them of saying insanity and nonsense, and then they say the exact same thing when they start. He tells him to mark. That means to understand or perceive or discern. He's basically just telling him to figure things out before you talk again. This seems to be a direct reference to verse 10 of the previous chapter in Job's conclusion, where he says, "But as for you all, do ye return, and come now, for I cannot find one wise man among you." He's telling them, go away, think more, figure this out, and then come back and talk, because you all sound like morons. And essentially, it sounds like that's what Bildad is saying to him at the start here. He's just reciting exactly what Job said before. This is a tactic his friends have used many times. Job will say something, and they will say pretty much the exact same thing, worded slightly different in their following argument. So it's very possible that it's just because he wasn't very creative in coming up with a first response. It's also possible that Bildad was doing this to mock him. We know from verse 4 of chapter 16 that his friends were mocking him quite openly up to this point, that they were shaking their heads at him. That was a very well-known form of mockery. So it wouldn't be a surprise if he was doing this very sarcastically. So Bildad then asks, though, why Job calls all his friends foolish. He does it in a very confrontational way and asks why Job considers them beasts. Job never called them beasts, but he just asserted that he knew a lot more than them. Back in chapters 12 and 13, stated anything they'd ever thought of, he'd thought of, that he knew everything they were ever going to come up with, and he was wiser than all of them put together. It's possible that Job was mocking them with this tone as they were mocking him, and Bildad took it very personally. But either way, his outrage after that, mocking and slandering Job, is very typical of those who do not want to confront the truth and don't want to be challenged on what they're asserting. He took it very, very personally because he's in the wrong, and that makes you take things very personally. Verse 4, however, is very odd. He says, "He teareth himself in his anger. Shall the earth be forsaken for thee? And shall the rock be removed out of his place?" This is is sort of a strangely put together verse, because usually when these people are speaking, they're talking to one another. One of them is addressing the other. Sometimes Job addresses the entire crowd, and then specific people, and then just his group of friends, and then God, and then everyone again. But his friends have, up to this point, pretty much exclusively been talking directly to him. The very first part of this verse, where he says, he teareth himself in his anger, this seems to be addressed to either the crowd or Job's friends. Bildad takes a break from talking to Job, talks to his friends, and says he's tearing himself in anger, and then goes back to talking to Job, which is a bit different from how they've mostly been talking. Most commentators believe that this is a reference, that what he's talking about here is Job chapter 13, verse 14, where Job talks about taking his flesh in his teeth. Let me read it real quick. Wherefore do I take my flesh in my teeth and put my life in mine hand? Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him, but I will maintain mine own ways before him. In this passage, Job is essentially asserting why he's saying what he's saying, why he's being accusatory towards God. He's saying, I still trust him, but I want answers, so I'm not going to be quiet, even if he'll kill me for wanting those answers. So it's possible that what Bildad is saying here is he's openly acknowledged that he's causing the things that are happening to him, the bad things. He's openly said that he's doing it. He told us that he knows God's unhappy with what he's saying, and he's going to be punished for it, but he's doing it anyway. And then the second part of the verse, where he says, shall the earth be forsaken for thee, and the rock be removed out of his place, is a rhetorical question of him essentially asking, is the world going to change what it's always done? Is truth itself going to alter itself just for you? You've already acknowledged that what you're saying is wrong, and you're bringing judgment on yourself. So why are you still arguing with us? You've already admitted it. Do you want to be treated differently from the rest of humanity? It's sort of a bad faith response, but in fairness, Job isn't really engaging with their assertions either, because they will not listen to him, and they just continue asserting the same thing over and over. So he just sort of moves on and ignores them, and then they always try to bring it back to the central point, which is Job's a sinner who's caused all of this because he's an evil, terrible man, and he needs to repent of it. But that's essentially what verse 4 is saying. It's an odd one as far as the phrasing goes in comparison to the rest. So Bildad continues, Yea, the light of the wicked shall be put out, and the spark of his fire shall not shine. The light shall be dark in his tabernacle, and his candle shall be put out with him. The steps of his strength shall be straitened, and his own counsel shall cast him down. For he's cast into a net by his own feet, and he walketh upon a snare. The gin shall take him by the heel, and the robber shall prevail against him. The snare is laid for him in the ground, and a trap for him in the way. Terror shall make him afraid on every side, and shall drive him to his feet. His strength shall be hunger-bitten, and destruction shall be ready at his side. It shall devour the strength of his skin. Even the firstborn of death shall devour his strength. His confidence shall be rooted out of his tabernacle, and it shall bring him to the king of terrors. So Bildad is now bringing it right back to what all of his friends always talk about, which is the wicked suffer and the righteous prosper. That's always been their central assertion. Eliphaz stated it when he first started arguing against Job, that he saw this in a vision. A spirit approached him while he was asleep and told him that God punishes the wicked because men are wicked, but the righteous don't suffer. It's only the extremely wicked. And they took that to mean Job is an evil man who has committed many sins, and he needs to repent of them to get his status back. And that if they're not suffering, that means that they're not wicked men, is the logical conclusion to draw from it, which Job has pointed out in the past. So verses 5 and 6 are pretty straightforward, very, very simple ones. God's going to leave the wicked alone, abandoned, confused, cold, and in the darkness. They're not going to have anything in life. Verse 7 is a little bit different. To straighten steps, which it says to start, the steps of his strength shall be straightened, means to narrow or frustrate someone's steps, basically to make their path harder to walk. And the counsel that's referred to here is not specifically advisors. It can refer to counselors, but it also often just refers more generally to planning in general, a person's plans and the thoughts they take of themselves. So essentially what he's saying is a wicked man will bring himself down by foolishly walking into traps. And that's what he lays out in verses 8 to 9. He's cast into a net by his own feet, and he walketh upon a snare. A snare is a very specific type of trap where a cord or a wire wraps around a central part of a body and either suspends someone up off the ground or continues to constrict as they try to get free in order to usually cut off circulation. In verse 9, he says, the gin shall take him by the heel. A gin is just a big metal net. It was another type of trap that they used. And the robber shall prevail against him. This, of course, is just a thug who takes things from you. The snare is laid for him in the ground and a trap for him in the way, which is just reasserting what he stated in verses 8 and 9. So Essentially, what he's implying here is that a wicked man will, because he's wicked, make poor decisions. He'll take counsel. He'll try to make a wise path going forward. But because he's wicked, the path won't be wise. He'll walk into traps and into the path of robbers, and he'll lose everything. The implication from that is very clear. He's saying that, Job, you lost everything because you did wrong and you made foolish decisions. And because of that, you walked right into the trap of losing everything that you ever had. He's essentially stating that that Job's loss is not supernatural. This is not a divine judgment from God specifically on Job. He's essentially ignoring the weather aspect of what destroyed everything that Job had, and is just asserting that the reason he lost everything is because he made bad choices, because he's a wicked man. It's sort of a very disrespectful way of viewing the plight of Job. He's not saying you're being punished by God. He's saying you're just dumb. You caused this because you did bad things and it made you stupid. So now you made terrible choices. It is very disrespectful, especially to someone like Job, who was famous for being wise and a good counselor and giving good advice to people. Again, he probably took this personally from what Job stated at the beginning of chapter 16, when he called them all miserable comforters. There we go. I've heard many such things, miserable comforters are ye all. That was what Job told his friends. Again, I mentioned it before, we often look at that and it sounds like sort of a humorous response, but there was nothing humorous about it at the time. As older, wise men, Job's friends could only advise and counsel and comfort people. That was their place in society. And he was telling them, you're terrible at it. The one thing that you still have to do, the one purpose you still have in life, you fail at. It's very possible Bildad took it personally, and so he's accusing Job of also being foolish and being terrible at the only thing he was supposed to be able to do. This could also explain, however, why none of them are listening to Job. Because if they actually believe that he has become foolish and just doesn't understand things anymore, then nothing he says matters, because he's wrong, because he makes foolish decisions. So if Bildad earnestly believes this course of argument, which we'll never know if he does or not, of course, that could explain why his friends refused to listen to him, although it's certainly not the only explanation one needs to understand why they wouldn't. In verse 11, he states that wicked men are essentially never comfortable. He says, terror shall make him afraid on every side and drive him to his feet. Essentially, they're never comfortable, they never trust any of their surroundings, and they're always on the move to keep from getting caught by whatever is chasing them. His strength shall be hunger-bitten, and destruction shall be ready at his side. So always weak, always starving, always having difficulty procuring what you need, and destruction is right at the doorstep every time. You make one slip up if you're wicked, and you die and it's over. And then verse 13 builds on this idea by asserting a sickness will kill them. It shall devour the strength of the skin, even the firstborn of death shall devour his strength. The firstborn of death is believed by most commentators to be just a reference to sickness. Back in this time of the early earth, it's very possible, I believe, that sickness was a rarity. People lived for a lot longer, especially prior to the flood, but even right after, people lived for a very long time. I believe that's because human DNA hadn't been very mutated by the sun yet, which the sun does mutate human DNA, and that's usually what causes cancer. That had not had time to build up for several generations, and bacteria and viruses had not had time to adjust to human immune systems and start killing them in large numbers. And so sicknesses, especially horrific ones like what was happening to Job, were rather rare. As a result of that, it's very possible that they sort of viewed them as scarier than they actually were sometimes, and would assume that they were all divine judgment, since it wasn't a commonality like it is now. This is conjecture for the most part. I think it's rooted in reason, but the Bible does not strictly assert that. But it is rather clear that he's talking about sickness, because Bildad is trying to relate all of this back to Job, and one of Job's major complaints, and one of the things that's most obvious about him at this point, is that he is very sick, very uncomfortable, and in constant agony because of the sickness that racks him. And so that's what he's focusing on now. He says in verse 14, his confidence shall be rooted out of his tabernacle, and it shall bring him to the king of terrors. This is sort of a flowery way of saying something that's pretty basic. A tabernacle refers to either a man's home or, more often, his body. And the assertion is that he'll have no comfort or strength in whichever one it's talking about because of the judgments that are on him. It seems to be specifically talking about sickness at this point, so I assume it's talking about, when it says tabernacle, a man's body. The sickness will take away all the confidence that someone has in themselves because they're very ill, and it'll also take away any strength that you can possibly have to do anything in the world. The king of terrors is likely just death. I mean, it's the thing that people fear more than anything else. It's basically the root of all fear is the idea that you're going to die. People do everything they can to avoid it, to not think about it, to run away from it, and to stave it off for as long as they possibly can. It is the start of all fear, and it's the biggest fear that people have. And so I believe that that's what it's talking about. It's saying that the judgments will bring people to the thing that they fear most, which is death. The strange part is, of course, that in verse 5, the person he's talking about with all of this is the wicked man, but Bildad knows very well all humans die. So the idea that only the wicked men are brought to death by judgment is absurd. That's the only reason anyone is ever brought to death is because of judgment, because otherwise we wouldn't die. In verse 15, it says, "It shall dwell in his tabernacle, because it is none of his. Brimstone shall be scattered upon his habitation." So for the most part, even though a lot of this has been relating to Job like that, that's who he's talking about really. He's been talking about judgment in general and sicknesses specifically, but he hasn't been referring exactly to Job. But the assertion in verse 15, the first part of it seems to be that sickness will basically claim someone's body out from under them. It'll dwell in his tabernacle because it is none of his. It takes the tabernacle from him, and so he no longer owns his own body because the sickness has it. But the reference to brimstone, that is, I believe, very clearly directly referencing what happened to Job. Brimstone was used by Satan to kill all of Job's sheep. That was a major part of his wealth, and it was fire and brimstone from heaven that fell down and consumed those flocks and the servants tending them. So now he's getting a lot more personal and a lot more specific, and it continues that way. In verse 16, he says, "His roots shall be dried up beneath, and above shall his branch be cut off." The roots and branches being dried up and cut off are references to accomplishments, ancestors, and most importantly, children and descendants, as it pertains to branches. Verses 17 and then 18, "His remembrance shall perish from the earth, and he shall have no name in the street. He shall be driven from light into darkness and chased out of the world." So these are supposed to make Job feel empty and full of dread. That is the only reason anyone would ever say that, is to try and bring him as low as they possibly could. The thing that Job has bemoaned more than anything else up to this point has been the loss of his children and the fact that he will have no name once he's gone, that people will forget him. That's been his biggest fear, the thing that concerns him the most, is that he has no more family, there will be no descendants, and his name will have meant nothing on the earth. And Bildad is telling him, that's true. It will mean nothing, and no one will remember you when you die, because that's what happens to the wicked men. They lose everything. He's essentially pressing on the fears that Job has expressed to them, because they were his friends, and using them to try and hurt him. It's a very cold-hearted tactic just to try and win an argument that doesn't really matter in the long run. In verses 19 and 21, he says, "He shall neither have son nor nephew among his people, nor any remaining in his dwellings. They that come after him shall be astonished at his day, as they that went before were affrighted. Surely such are the dwellings of the wicked, and this is the place of him that knoweth not God." So Bildad's arguments close in stating that there will be no family left from the person. They'll be forever remembered as a disgrace and a byword. People will look back on them astonished that someone could even live this way and let all this happen to him. These are not general accusations or assertions about wickedness, as most of the friends have stated before. These are very directly pointed at Job specifically, which is, again, a very cold-hearted thing to do. In all of these proclamations, Bildad, of course, cites no sources of any kind. He doesn't have any of the Lord's inspired writing to rely on. He's not quoting any prophecy. He wasn't even the one that the Spirit talked to. And Eliphaz laid out what the Spirit said. Even that faulty source that they were using, Bildad is not even paying attention to here. He's making very pointed, specific accusations against Job, stating, we know you're wicked because this is happening to you. It's a logical fallacy called begging the question. He's saying, we know you're wicked because the things that happen to wicked people are happening to you. How do we know they happen to wicked people? Because they're happening to you. It's illogical. He's assuming that Job is wicked because of the things that are happening to him, and he's assuming the things that happen to him are caused by wickedness because they're happening to Job. That's not how an argument works. But what this does do, because he's a friend of Job's, is it insults, belittles, and hurts him, because Job wants his friends to like him. He wanted them to comfort him, not hurt him. And that's all that this argument does, is tries to hurt him. So, given the mocking nature of the debate thus far, it does seem very clear to me that Bildad has no intention of trying to bring Job back to some sort of place of repentance, that's not really his concern at this point. He's completely thrown that out the window, and all he cares about now is winning the argument. And we've talked about why they want to win the argument so bad, and we'll see it in the next chapter as well. It's because they're afraid of this happening to them. If this happened to Job, and Job was the most righteous, perfect man on earth that a human could reach, then it could happen to anyone. That's terrifying if you were a person with a lot to lose, which his friends were. They were wealthy, wise men, influential people in their cities. They likely had many children of their own because people had children. And they don't want to lose all of that randomly, as far as they can tell randomly. So they want to find a reason why that cannot be the case. And Satan, with his spirit in Eliphaz's dream, has given them the reason that this won't happen to them, even though it's a lie. And so they're taking it and running with it because they don't want to acknowledge the truth. So it's not about Job, and it never was. It's about them. It's about making themselves feel more comfortable by trying to force him to admit he's done wrong so that then they can go home happy, knowing that this won't happen to me because he admitted to it. That's all they're trying to do, is break him down to the point where he admits it just to be done with it. Job begins his response, however, in chapter 19, the same way that Bildad has so far began both of his, with the words, how long? This is how Bildad has begun both of his accusations to this point. And so Job, starting it that way, it seems to be maybe a little bit mocking. It's possible that he thinks this is the only way he can break through him is by mirroring his own tactics. I think it's likely more of a mocking tone. He's just responding the same way that Bildad has started. But he states, how long will ye vex my soul and break me in pieces with words? These 10 times have ye reproached me. Ye are not ashamed that ye make yourselves strange to me. So I believe that he's not specifically trying to mock him. He was trying to call back to his other speeches, but I don't believe it was mockery because from these words, Job sounds deeply hurt by what Bildad has just said to him. He's saying that his friends are vexing or torturing and troubling him, that they've broken him in pieces. He's not stated anyone has done anything like that except God himself. God's the only one who he said has caused that much damage to him. The rest of the things that are happening, he puts them all on God and says, it was God who did this to me. It wasn't the men, the Sabians, and the Chaldeans who broke me. It wasn't even the people of the city who abused me and kicked me out. It wasn't even my wife who turned on me. It was God who shook me and broke me in pieces. He's now stating that his friends have hurt him just as deeply by their words against him. Bildad's words did exactly what Bildad wanted them to do. And he now feels very poorly about himself and about them as a result. He asserts that his friends have reproached him 10 times. Now, I can't find a reason that he would use the word 10 for literary reasons. This is the fifth response. Bildad's response here is the fifth one. There have been 2 from Eliphaz, 1 from Zophar, now 2 from Bildad. And at no point in any of their specific arguments do they only lay out 10 specific reasons. That tells me that 10 is likely a more symbolic number than an actual literal number that he's talking about. It's either that or there was more to the debate that wasn't recorded, which I don't believe because God doesn't normally leave things out. When the whole point of the thing is a debate, I don't believe he'd leave parts out of it. So I think that it's most likely it's a symbolic number. People believe that the number 10 is symbolic of completion. It's used in Genesis during the creation of the world many times and throughout the Bible elsewhere. And so it's most likely just a symbolic number that was carried over from the time of creation that people held on to in the early human civilizations. So that'd be my assertion for why he says specifically 10 times. He says as well that they're not ashamed and they make themselves strange to him. What he means by this is that the friends he thought he had, he now realizes he did not and possibly never has. The people who he thought of as his friends don't exist. And the people before him are strangers that he's never met before, which is even more hurting to him because that means that he now is well and truly alone, at least in his eyes. In verse 4, he says, "And be it indeed that I have erred, and mine error remaineth with myself. If indeed you will magnify yourselves against me, and plead against me my reproach, know now that God hath overthrown me, and hath compassed me with his net." So verse 4 is one of the most reasonable responses that Job has given to his friends thus far. He states that if he has erred, then he's only done it against himself. The only person who suffered as a result of his actions is him. He's harmed no one willingly, and he said everything out of sincerity. He just wants answers. And he's then accusing his friends afterwards of magnifying themselves against him, lifting them, as he's accused them of this before, that because they're wealthy and in good stable positions, they feel comfortable attacking him because he's now poor and helpless. This is, again, a common thing you'll see in human society. The rich attack the poor attack the rich. Anyone who is in a different place from someone else assumes that the people are there because there's something wrong with them. It's a very very natural thing for humans to do. It takes a lot to overcome it. And that's what his friends have done to him. Job accuses them of that in prior chapters as well. And he's accusing them of it again here. He says, you'll magnify yourselves against me and plead against me my reproach. He's asking why they're constantly doing this. He says in verse 6, God hath overthrown me and hath compassed me with his net. He's saying it's not, men aren't doing this to me, God is doing this to me. Why do you feel the need to come against me, use my reproaches to attack me, and continuously debate and try to tear me down? God is already doing it. You don't have to help. Nothing you say is going to make a difference. God's already taking care of it. What do you have to gain from it? It's also sort of a warning. He's told them, you magnified yourselves against me. People know that pride is wrong. They've always known that. I think he's trying to warn them also, as he's done before, that in speaking for God and in speaking of how God treats people with no real sources behind that, they are running a risk of God proving to them that that's not how he operates. And he's trying to warn them away from it. In verse 7, he says, behold, I cry out of wrong, but I am not heard. I cry aloud, but there is no judgment. He hath fenced up my way that I cannot pass, and he hath set darkness in my paths. He hath stripped me of my glory, and taken the crown from my head. He hath destroyed me on every side, and I am gone, and mine hope hath he removed like a tree. He hath also kindled his wrath against me, and he counteth me unto him as one of his enemies. His troops come together and raise up their ways against me, and encamp round about me my tabernacle. So verse 7 may be literal or figurative. I'm not 100% sure which. But he says, I cry out of wrong, but I'm not heard. I cry aloud, there is no judgment. To cry out wrong, what the word translated wrong here is chamas, and it refers to cruelty, to violence, injustice. Those are the things. And yes, that's why the terrorist organization is called that. So essentially, he's saying, I have been wronged, and I've called for it, but there's no judgment. The word translated for judgment can refer to either a specific legal case or just the concept and abstract idea of justice in general. So he's saying, I've been wronged, I've called it out, and there has been no justice. This could be a reference to Job pleading for a daysman, as he's asked for many times, to come between him and other men, both to vindicate him to other people, and between him and God, so that someone can argue on his behalf, someone who's as perfect as God, because he feels that he's being mistreated, but he can't argue against God. He'd obviously lose. It could be that. It can also be a direct reference to him being actually abused by the people of the city. It's clear that the people of the city come out and mock him. I believe that they have spat on him in the past, and it's possible a few of the verses could refer to them physically attacking him in the dump that he lived in outside the city. If that's the case, then this verse could mean that he's asking people, he's telling people that he's being mistreated and no one in the city cares. There's no justice, there's no judgment against people that hurt him. He has no defender on earth. It could go either way. I lean towards the first, that this is him asking for help, arguing against God and against other men. And this is just him referencing again. But it could be the latter, that he is being mistreated by the people of the city, because he stated before that is something that was happening. So he goes on to repeat his complaints against God's treatment of him once again. Verses 8 to 12 are very similar to things that he said before. God follows him very closely, doesn't let him mess up even a little bit without immediately punishing him. God's treating him like an enemy. He's closed him in with other foes so that he can't go anywhere. He can't do anything. He feels completely stuck and alone, and like God is toying with him before inevitably killing him. This is no different than what he's stated many times. Verses 13 and 14, however, give us a little bit of new information about Job and his past, or his surroundings. He says, he hath put my brethren far from me, and mine acquaintance are verily estranged from me. My kinsfolk have failed, and my familiar friends have forgotten me. So this verse seems to indicate that Job had still living family. He had brethren, which can also refer to sisters. It's just a general term for siblings. But that they had completely abandoned him, and his friends have forgotten him. It seems pretty clear that the end of verse 14, where he talks about his friends, that's referring to the three friends that are right in front of him. He may have had other friends that didn't show up, but these three did. He obviously would have considered them familiar friends, familiar meaning close. And to say that they've forgotten him doesn't mean that they have simply ignored him. It can also mean they've forgotten the friendship that they had, and they're treating him not as a friend, but as a target, which his friends are doing. This hurts him quite deeply. He wants that to end, and he's pointing it out to them, probably in the hope that they will stop going deeper into the pit that they're going into. Eliphaz's statement so far, his statement before that Job responded to in chapter 16 and 17, was somewhat pointed, but not nearly as much as Bildad's. It was still very general. And almost all of the other speeches they had before generally had a call to repentance. Even though they're wrong, they at least made the attempt to try and tell Job, just straighten up, just repent of what you're doing wrong and come back, and it'll all be over. But if you look through chapter 18, Bildad gave no such reassurance. He stated that all of this terrible stuff is going to happen to you. You're going to be forgotten. You're going to have no family. You're going to have no reason to ever have lived, and you're going to die, and that's going to be the end of it because you're wicked. That's a very grim statement. And Job then realizes, now in verse 14, that his friends have forgotten him. They don't see him as a friend anymore, and they are here to try and hurt him. He says in verse 15, "They that dwell in mine house and my maids count me for a stranger. I'm an alien in their sight. I called my servant, and he gave me no answer. I entreated him with my mouth." So this indicates that Job does still have a household. We know that he had a big estate because he was a wealthy man, likely within the city of Uz itself. And, of course, he had servants who operated it. Many of them were killed in the initial disaster when he lost everything due to weather or due to bandit attacks. But there were some of them who were still there, those 4 who arrived, and there would have been servants in his house, and his house was untouched as far as we can tell. But he's not living in his house right now. He's living in the ash heap outside of the city. It's pretty clear so far that that's because the city has abandoned him, essentially. They ousted him from the city, probably because he is very sick, but also because of the troubles that came upon him. Whatever caused that for him, they don't want to cause it to them. So they're just going to get rid of him because they're a superstitious bunch, and they don't want to deal with that either. Either way, he does still have a household in the city, but he's alone there too. He says that his maids and his servants, they don't respond to him. When he calls to them, they don't give him an answer. They ignore him. They act like they don't know who he is. And it's even more hurtful. The people that he paid to have a relationship with his family, to take care of things for him, even they completely ignore him. And that tells us also that they are probably still getting paid to live there. It's possible it could mean slaves. There are some of God's people who have owned actual slaves throughout history. They usually treat them very well. But that is possible also. But we really don't know enough about the society of Uz to know one way or the other. Given that slavery is almost as old as mankind, I could assume that they'd be slaves. But also given Job's temperament thus far, it'd seem a little bit out of character for him to expect that from them, if they were slaves. In verse 17, he says, "My breath is strange to my wife, though I entreated her for the children's sake of mine own body." So this is him now, for the first time, speaking of the lost relationship with his wife. She, of course, left him in chapter 2 before his friends ever arrived. He was already outside the city at that point. She asked him why he was carrying this on and told him to curse God and die. That hurt him for many reasons, but not least of all is that she wants him to die, is essentially what that means. She's tired of this going on. She just wants him to get it over with and get God to kill him. That undoubtedly hurt very deeply. It hurt a lot more that she cut off her communication with him. But this verse seems to indicate that he tried to get her attention back several times, that he has attempted to bridge that gap and reestablish a relationship with her. He says, "My breath is strange to my wife." Most people believe this is due to the sickness that he had, that his breath actually smelled terrible and it was repulsive to her. But the word translated strange here doesn't mean vile. It simply means abnormal or alien. It's the same word you'd use to describe a foreigner you've never met before who comes into your city. She simply treated him like the servants did. She acts like she doesn't know him anymore, and she refuses to interact with him. The second half of the verse, "though I entreated for the children's sake of mine own body," this seems to indicate that she rejected any physical advances that he attempted to make as well, that she refused to touch him at all, to show any sort of affection. She cut it off completely and had no relationship with him of any kind after this, meaning that he was well and truly, as far as humanity goes, alone. In verse 18, he says, "Yea, young children despised me. I arose, and they spake against me." This tells him that children mocked him. Now, some people believe that the children referred to here are the children of his servants, but there's nothing in the passage that indicates that directly. It could just be children of the city. That one seems most likely to me because children, especially back in the day when they didn't have other ways of entertaining themselves, would entertain themselves by trying to harm or abuse the underprivileged. People who were poor would be picked on by rich kids. Children who had major defects and they were lame, or they couldn't speak, or they could speak but they were bad at it, they had impediments and stuff, they were abused by the children who didn't have these issues. And that's a very common thing in life. Well, when children are not restrained, they will do the same thing to adults who suffer in these instances as well. And it seems that that's what was happening here. Even the children of the city were mocking him and belittling him and making him feel worse about himself. So the entire city, including his household, which was still maintained in it, have nothing to do with him. And now, even his family that's still alive elsewhere in the world and his friends also have nothing to do with him. I think it's very likely that he had family in the city itself, but given that his friends traveled from around the other cities around, it's possible that his siblings also lived in other cities. He says in verse 19, "All my inward friends abhorred me, and they whom I loved are turned against me. My bone cleaveth to my skin and to my flesh, and I am escaped with the skin of my teeth." So in verse 19 is essentially a summation of the prior verses. Everyone that he's ever cared about no longer cares about him. Everyone he still cares about won't care about him. And in verse 20, he states that the only thing he got away with, essentially, is the skin of his teeth. He talks about his bone cleaving to his skin. David refers to similar feelings when he was under judgment from God, and he was very ill. He talks about his bones cleaving to his flesh. It's a common way for people to describe their sicknesses in the Bible. It seems that that's a direct reference to the illness that he had, but him escaping with the skin of his teeth, I believe that simply means he was forced out of the city and away from all relationships with any people with nothing. He had nothing to take with him except his own body. It was all that he had left, and even that was falling apart. In verse 21, he says, "Have pity upon me. Have pity upon me, O ye my friends, for the hand of God hath touched me. Why do ye persecute me as God, and are not satisfied with my flesh?" So this is a sharp change in his approach to his friends this far. He's no longer being confrontational. He's no longer mocking them back as they're mocking him. He's simply pleading with them, begging that they'll show him some comfort and some pity like he has asked them to, and like he told them he would if the situations were reversed. He asks why they're trying to judge him like God in verse 22. Why do ye persecute me as God? Why they're not satisfied with everything that he's lost so far, and they want him to lose more. See, they don't understand how it feels to be him because they're so lost in their own arguments. They believe that he's wicked, that he's harboring wickedness, and he refuses to let it go despite everything that he's lost. And because of that, they deny themselves the ability to comprehend the feeling that he's going through, knowing that the only people he had left that he thought he could trust and that he thought cared about him are here to hurt him. And when he realizes that, all that he wants in the world is for a few people to actually show they still care. But they won't. They constantly mock him and throw the accusations back at him. And we'll see that going forward as well. His friends still, Bildad still has another argument, Eliphaz has one, and Zophar has one. They do not turn around. They do not show him pity, and they do not show him comfort. None of them ever do. He just continues to be broken down by them again and again and again. But he then goes on an interesting tirade that, again, alters the tone of the rest of his argument. In verse 23, "Oh, that my words were now written. Oh, that they were printed in a book, that they were graven with an iron pen and lead in the rock forever. For I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth. And though after my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh shall I see God, whom I shall see for myself, and mine eyes shall behold, and not another, though my reins be consumed within me." This is a very different turn from what he has stated before. There is no longer any clever ways of talking around the hope that he has after death. He's no longer very carefully dancing around the subject. He is very openly stating that he has complete and total faith in God. He just wants comfort. He asks that his words be printed in a book and graven with an iron pen and lead in the rock forever. He wants everything that he's saying to be recorded for all of time so that he's not forgotten, so that people do have a reason, so that righteous men can use him as an inspiration and stand up against wickedness and against trials and against frustrations and difficulties, as he stated in the chapters before. And he got exactly what he wished for. I don't know if he had prophetic knowledge that this would happen at some point, if that's what altered the course of his arguments, or that he suddenly understood this was an argument that was going to be recorded for all of history. But it seems very interesting to me that either way, he wanted that to be something that was carried on. You don't see that in most arguments, even when people take themselves very seriously. There are a few people who really do just want to be remembered for posterity, for the the preservation and help of generations ahead. That's a rare and a rather selfless attitude to have, and it's one that he did have. He wanted other people to use his example so that they could go through these difficulties. Because no matter the reasons for this happening, he knows he's not done some sort of grave wickedness that's brought all this judgment upon him. He knows that it happened because God wanted it to happen. And because of that, he knows that it can happen again to anyone, even the most righteous man on earth. So he wants this to be an example for them so that when God does test someone else harshly, they can use this as a reason for why it's happening. That's what he wants. In verse 25, however, he then speaks directly of prophetic knowledge that he has. I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth. To say my Redeemer liveth at this time is a very interesting way to phrase it. See, the Lord Jesus, of course, had not come to earth in human form. He had not died yet and then rose again. When we say that our Redeemer lives, that we're making a proclamation. We believe that he died, was buried, and that he rose again, according to the Scriptures. That had not happened yet. None of that had happened yet. There was no indication that was going to happen yet. This is long before any of the other prophecies we have recorded of the specifics of the Lord's coming. And yet, he states specifically that his Redeemer liveth. That's a very interesting way to phrase it, and indicates that he had a lot more foreknowledge about the events that were going to transpire when the Lord came to earth than most people think they had at that time. We know they had other prophets. We know Abel was a prophet. We know Enoch was a prophet. It's very possible there were others as well. We know that Noah was a preacher, and we know that Job was given prophecies. But we don't know the specifics of what they were given. It seems very clear from this, however, that they had very intimate knowledge of what God was going to do in the future as it pertained to the Redeemer. But more than that, the resurrection. That he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth. He knew that the Lord, when he redeemed him, would be here on earth, specifically on earth when it was done. Not in heaven, not that earth is a purgatory where everyone stays and dies and they go somewhere better. He was going to come to earth and stand here, and that Job was going to be standing next to him. Though after my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh shall I see God, whom I shall see for myself, and mine eyes shall behold, and not another. Though my reins be consumed within me. He's telling him, my body's going to decay before this happens. My reins, which we saw before, that refers to kidneys, but really to any internal organs, vital ones specifically. He's saying, though everything about me is going to go away, all my organs are going to be gone, my body's going to be completely decayed and destroyed by the worms, it won't matter. My eyes will return. I'll see God with them. My body will be reconstructed, and I will be on this earth with him. He knew this was going to happen, and he knew it thousands of years before any of the other prophecies in the Old Testament or the New were given regarding the resurrection. This is a very important thing to remember. It's important not just because we can use that hope going forward as well, that when we go through these difficult times, we can use the hope of a resurrection to carry us through them, because no matter what trials we experience here, there's something better ahead. That is a great hope, and we should hold on to that, and we should remember it. But that's not the only reason that this is important. People often misunderstand how the ancient world operated. They look at the ancient kingdoms and they see them as places where God never had an influence. They've never heard the word of God. They didn't know any better. They were doing terrible things because God never shone his light on them. That is very clearly not the case. Since the flood and before it, and then all the time after it, God has had prophets throughout the world. Melchizedek was not related to Abraham in any way, and yet he was the high priest of God, and he was a king in the Middle East, directly in the middle of Canaan. People overlook that. They overlook the fact that Job was in Edom prior to Esau's birth, a long time before that. He was here, and he was a prophet of God. He was the wealthiest man in the region. This story would have been well known by everyone in the entire area for generations after that. And their descent into idolatry and wickedness had to come despite the prophecies that God had given them. Prophecies that we don't even have full records of because they weren't for us. They had them then, and they rejected them. This is an important thing to remember whenever Israel or any other nation was used to visit judgment upon these ancient peoples. They were not in the darkness with no witnesses to God's light. They were surrounded by it. It had permeated their cultures for generations before, and they purged it because they chose idolatry over the Lord, and he punished them for it. That's why Canaan fell into such depraved wickedness, and it's why they were destroyed after 400 years, is because this sort of teaching and preaching, these prophecies were abandoned by the people who were there. They had no interest in the promises of God's resurrection. They only had an interest in their current earthly gratification, which they believed they would get by serving devils. So it's an important thing to remember. These prophecies existed. They existed in full detail, and there were people who loudly proclaimed them to crowds back in that day. People always knew about the resurrection. They always knew about the Lord who was going to redeem them. And the ones who chose not to accept that did not do so out of ignorance. They did it because they did not care about God. Job closes this argument, verses 28 and 29. But ye should say, why persecute we him, seeing the root of the matter is found in me? Be ye afraid of the sword, for wrath bringeth the punishments of the sword, that ye may know there is a judgment. So this is a warning to his friends, a very clear, direct warning. It sort of mirrors the start of this response. He says that they need to look inward. They need to see the same wickedness that they're accusing Job of inside of themselves because it's there. And that they should fear the judgment that they are clearly afraid of and trying to use him to get away from. In chapter 6, which was quite some time ago, it was his first response, Job's first response to Eliphaz. He stated partway through it in verse, let me see here. I didn't write down the specific verse. He says, let me see here. I can't remember exactly where it is. He goes through a decent portion of it and essentially accuses his friends of being deceptive by their very nature. He thought that they came to comfort him, and after 7 days of silence, he bemoaned his condition, and he expected them to comfort him through it. Instead, Eliphaz responded with accusations and told him, this is your fault and you need to repent, or this is never going to go away. That caught Job completely off guard. He did not expect that. And he accused them of being a river in the middle of the desert in the hot summer that pretends it's there like a mirage, and then when the army that's invading comes to get water because they're dying of thirst, it's gone. So that's what you are. You're a false river. You came here to bring, you pretended that you were here to bring me comfort, to bring me sustenance, and instead, you were just here to hurt me. That's essentially what he's accusing them of here as well, or warning them of the judgment of that sort of actions. And he told them then that they had no reason to fear. He said, if I asked you to house me, to clothe me, to bring me food, if I asked you to rouse armies and go after the robbers who took everything from me, no. But that's what they were afraid of in his eyes. He was afraid that they were afraid that he was either going to ask them to take care of things for him, that he was going to try and use their wealth, their power, their influence to get everything he had back, which he would never have done, as he makes clear to them, or that the judgment that came on him could come on anyone because it's not about judgment for sin. That either one of those things could be true. And he's telling them that you should fear that judgment. You should fear the sword that can come upon you out of nowhere. Because if it happened to me, then it can happen to you. That I know my Redeemer lives. I know that I'm going to die. I know this body's going to decay and it's going to fall to nothing. But I'm going to be back. The Lord's going to be on this earth. And I'm going to see him. I'm going to stand with him. And so because I know that's true, then I know this isn't because of wickedness. And I know that the thing you're afraid of can happen to you. So you should be afraid of it. He's saying that you should look inwardly, so that if this is because of wickedness that I've committed, which he stated before he believes it could be, he believes that God is punishing him for the sins he has sacrificed for when he was a youth, that if that is the case, which is the best conclusion Job can come up with too, well then the wickedness that you're committing by slandering me and blaspheming God as well will come back to bite you. He said you need to look inwardly. You need to see the thing that you're accusing me of is in you. That way you can stop this before the judgment comes on you. And that's how he closes chapter 19, which is his one chapter argument to build at. He doesn't give it much more thought than that. And his answers, they continue to get a bit shorter until his final one, where he gives a very long answer and then cuts it off. It's possible his answers are getting shorter simply because he doesn't see a reason to keep arguing, but he has stated before that he feels his life is coming to an end. He thinks that this is his last day on earth, and that when this is done, his sickness will reach its conclusion, and he'll die, and that'll be the end of it. And so it's very possible he was also getting very emotional and very exhausted by the whole ordeal. And so it's taking the energy out of him to continue arguing. But his responses, and even those of his friends, continue to get shorter as time goes on until he gives one very long one. There aren't very many arguments left, one from each of them, essentially, in Job's responses to those, after which the book moves in a different direction. The debate is over, and it moves on to the discourse of Eliphaz, Elihu, which is very different from his friends, and that'll be an interesting place to get to. That is going to be all for tonight. You're dismissed.